So, Nostalgia Critic is doing a month of Spider-Man movies, but not apparently Spider-Verse, and I'm not sure about the MCU ones, but he's definitely doing all the Sam Raimi ones, and I believe the Mark Webb ones. I'm going to talk about his review of Spider-Man and then Spider-Man 2. Back to back, I took notes so I can remember some of this, but here's the basic thing I think with the Spider-Man reviews. I don't think they're like his worst thing ever. They're not as bad as The Wall, but I think he misses the point of the whole movie. In that, both these are based on Steve Ditko and John Romita's Spider-Man, like the first 100 issues of Spider-Man. It's very clear if you read Spider-Man comics. He does bring up a good point about the Spider-Man comics with the Gwen Stacy death reference in the first Spider-Man, and he brings that up, and it's like, he clearly understands, like, they used this incorrectly, they just did the reference to do it, it's supposed to be this major moment in comics, and he just sort of referenced it to show, like, hey, we're doing this thing, but they don't fully use that emotional moment the way it's supposed to be used. Now, I agree with that, but he keeps mentioning how it feels old-fashioned and aw-shucksy and Norman Rockwell-ish, but I'm sort of like, dude, like, it's supposed to be like a 60s comic. He's directly influenced by that early Spider-Man run, and that's what that early Spider-Man run was like. Like, there's a part in 2 where there's the same kind of extra person, which he has an issue with extras in, like, people have one line in Spider-Man movies for some reason. He keeps bringing, he's very nitpicky. I've also realized I do not like the nostalgia. If there's any doubt in my mind, like, this did not change my mind on the nostalgia critic. But there's this one guy who says, like, your father, you're doing something your father could have never dreamed of. You're, like, winning his legacy. And then later after the explosion, he goes, like, he's ruined his father's legacy. And it's like, that's something Stan Lee would write. Like, Stanley's cheesy-ass writing. Like, that's what he did. And that's what these things are influenced by. Like, those kind of comics, that kind of writing, right? And it seems like he doesn't get that. And I don't know how he can not get that if he's read the comics. It's just baffling to me. So Doug Walker is clearly, like, does not understand the Ditko Bushima thing. But he also, like, doesn't really bring up that, like, this is very much a post 9/11 thing. He does, but he doesn't bring up how that, like, aw-shucksiness definitely worked for the post 9/11 era. It's kind of the perfect thing we needed. It's almost like he doesn't understand, like, this being a comic book-like movie, was what kind of influenced the MCU and showed you could bring comic books to the screen and people would accept it in such a way. Because he keeps arguing that, like, oh, this is so cheesy, it should be like real life, but it's not supposed to be like real life. You know, it's supposed to be like this weird comic booky world. So him not understanding that, I don't think he gets, like, the whole crux of it. And I also don't like, as someone who read comics from when I was like 7 to like 7, like when my dad bought comics, and like I read a ton of comics like every day through elementary school and middle school, like tons and tons of comics. I sort of don't like when people go, oh, I'm a male so I understand comic books, and I feel like he does that a lot, and it's kind of infuriating because I'm just watching it like, I don't think you really understand Spider-Man overall. I think you just assume because you're a boy you get Spider-Man, which is like insulting and very the white privilege that Doug Walker is. But anyway, he does actually have some funny jokes. I will say he has some funny observations. Some weird things is, like, he keeps bringing up how Willem Dafoe is doing a riff on Christopher Walken. I don't really get that, but okay. Doug Walker does have a funny joke about Willem Dafoe when it fills up with green smoke during the Green Goblin thing. He said he's getting funneled in all his farts from the lighthouse. I was like, that's a good joke. There are a couple of good jokes he had. He also doesn't really understand how actors work, like the whole thing about the 100 takes with the lunch tray scene. He's like, it would be like that Rick and Morty thing, and he'd be screaming. I'm like, they're professional actors, Doug. Like, they're trained not to freak out like that. Like, that's why they're actors. I don't think Doug actually gets into a movie. Like, he's so nitpicky with it. I'm like, do you ever just sit back and just, like, let the movie happen and later you think about your thoughts? It feels like he's just so ready to have a criticism. He's not really thinking about experiencing the movie and then having... You're supposed to have a criticism about the whole experience of the film. You're not supposed to go through every fucking stupid moment and just, like, criticize everything. Part of the problem I have with Doug is he didn't really understand criticism before he became a critic, and he came up with this weird amalgamation of, like, piecing through the plot. And there's often times where I'm like, you're just nitpicking on anything you can find, and you find that through both these reviews. He made a joke about, oh, they put Craigslist in newspapers, but it was like, I'm half not sure if that's a joke. He mentioned a couple times that the internet had an issue with the Tobey Maguire casting. I was reading, like, all the movie sites. Everyone was happy about that, as I recall. Nobody hated Tobey Maguire was pretty liked, so I'm a little confused. I guess he was just like, oh, that's what you're supposed to say about internet casting, so it's... Also, the thing with the J. Jonah Jameson thing, and anyone having any hard times in these movies, like, emotionally, he, like, criticizes them, and he, like, goes like, oh, that's not what you should have do, and, like, nitpicks them, especially people in a crisis and how they react to things, like when he's finding the guy who he thinks killed Uncle Ben, and he's not, like, seeing his face and all the things. I'm like, no, he's clearly, like, freaking out because his uncle just got killed. Like, have some, like, emotional understanding of what's going on with people, which he doesn't seem to have, which was just so weird, because it just feels like he, like, is so ready to nitpick these performances. He's not thinking about those things. But I also, one of the things I think about the original Spider-Man movie, which he doesn't say, is that the original Spider-Man movie, people let go of all those things because comic book movies, like, just did not work. Like, the first Bryan Singer X-Men has all these issues with it. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie was, like, such a breath of fresh air in terms of understanding comic book logic and all these things. And he doesn't really kind of understand the context of what he's talking about a lot of the time. So he's just, like, throwing out all this stuff, but I'm like, and talking about how he was, like, too serious for this sort of stuff. But it's like, that's not what this movie was trying to do. It's dumb to come at a movie with something that it doesn't do and doesn't even try to do and criticize it for it, because, like, that's not Spider-Man. It's not trying to be Blade. It's not trying to be Frank Miller. It's trying to be this certain thing, and your rejection of it just seems odd to me. There's a lot of things about Doug Walker I don't like, but his misunderstanding of criticism as a whole is one of my biggest things. He just doesn't really seem to understand the whole evolution of comic book movies, and how, like, literally at the time people were like, oh my god, this totally happened, was kind of one of the big things of the Spider-Man movie. So I don't think he really got that. I don't think it's a perfect film or anything like that, but it seems he didn't understand the 9/11 part. He didn't understand Steve Ditko thing. He didn't really understand the whole context of the movie. He just kind of went in and, like, kind of, like, half watched it and didn't do any research on it, and I guess no one told him otherwise. So this I didn't know, because I never watched Doug Walker unless I'm doing it for these things. But he gives money to charities, like, regularly. Did everyone know this? Like, any money he makes at a con goes to a charity, and he did it at the end of both Spider-Man reviews. Like, he regularly gives money to charity, and apparently a lot of money. I was kind of a little shocked by that. I think that's really cool. You know, I didn't know that. I give him a lot of credit for doing that. I think a lot of us are financially not able to do so. But credit to him for being able to do that. I think that's really cool. So I'm sure some of you did know that, but I you know what, regardless of what I think of him, I think that's a very positive thing, and I'm not going to talk shit about that. I think that's great. So I wanted to say that. So Spider-Man 2. The thing is with Spider-Man 2, he clearly really likes it. He pours on the cheese thing, and it's weird because he doesn't bring up that, like, certain, like, the Spider-Man No More thing is, like, a comic book cover. It's not even an obscure Spider-Man thing. He, again, does not notice that it is directly from a comic, even though he's supposedly read the comics. And it seems like if he has read the comics, he's read the 90s comics, which I've heard people keep telling me on Twitter he likes the Mark Webb ones. I don't know if that's true, but from his review I kind of could tell that. He makes a bunch of mentions of Spider-Man 3. I can tell he really wants to do Spider-Man 3 because that's more of his review. By the way, he keeps making references to the Disaster Artist through James Franco, which is like, I get that you're like, you do bad movies in the room, man, but it's like a little pathetic at this point. He does bring up things that work, like the Alex Ross opening, saying it's one of the best opening of all time. He brings up that it's unrealistic, which I don't get it. He mentions the guy in The Last Airbender in sort of a racist way, which I wasn't really comfortable with. He was bring up how he liked edgier, bloodier stuff, and that's why he didn't like these movies originally. Sort of reminds me of, like, I remember my dad didn't like the original Star Wars because it wasn't complex sci-fi, and I was sort of like, but that's not what it was trying to do. So yes, it would fail under that. But he keeps criticizing extras in this quite a lot, which is like, dude, this was like their one chance of fame. Like, kind of just like be chill about it. Like, it wasn't that bad. He brings up this Darth Vader thing when Dr. Ock says no. That was funny. He actually has good observations. He of course had to bring up the Doctor Strange thing. He brings up the thing with J. Jonah Jameson's son being an astronaut, which, like, that is in the comics. I don't know how to tell him that's not. Again, he should know that. If he read the comics, he clearly didn't. Duh. And he doesn't understand the source material because that is sort of a long thing, and then his son becomes a werewolf or something. Look, that's stupid. Comics are dumb sometimes. It's fine to have that in there and not do much about it, but he keeps bringing that up. It, like, really, there's like nitpicky things. He goes, I mean, some of them are like when the guy at the Daily Bugle looks at Peter Parker like Spider-Man was there, and I think you could read it either way, but Peter Parker is reading it as, oh fuck, does he like, no, I'm Spider-Man? But I think it was more like Spider-Man was there, Parker, what the fuck? But clearly he wasn't going to take pictures of that because that was like emotionally scarring, seeing his mentor like destroyed and all that, but whatever. He actually says this quote, and I think it sums up how he feels about Spider-Man 2. He says, sometimes I don't know what this movie is doing, I just know that I love it. It sort of sums it up. Like, he kind of doesn't fully rip this movie apart the way he originally did, and I find sometimes with his movies of classics that he doesn't really want to rip apart, but he likes, but isn't as passionate about. Because that's one thing I've noticed through watching these two. It feels like he's passionate about a certain amount of movies, but he's not really passionate about film as a whole. I've noticed he like, I feel most critics will just be like, this movie is a good movie, and I'm so happy I saw a good movie. And it feels like because it doesn't hit his various rules or whatever, even if it's good, he's like kind of begrudgingly gives it a good review, and I kind of felt that throughout this thing. Although he did have good things to say, but then he's like bringing up jokes too much that have like literally nothing to do with anything and aren't even that funny. The astronaut thing. But he did notice that like Thomas Jane has a cameo in the end of Spider-Man 2. Never knew that. I've seen Spider-Man 2 is one of my favorite movies of all time. I've seen it a million times. And he brings up the emotional big parts of it. But he is so looking forward to Spider-Man 3. I think he knows that's going to be a big video for him. I would say the problem I have with Doug Walker on these Spider-Man reviews is he sort of misses the point of what these films are. They're trying to represent the original Spider-Man run. They're trying to represent the Steve Ditko run. And they're doing a specific thing. And also it's like Sam Raimi. He gets some of that with the Doc Ock thing with the arms and the Evil Dead references. But Sam Raimi likes classic films and aw shucksiness. And I get that that isn't like the realism he necessarily likes, but first off, film isn't realism. Film is like, you know, performance, and I don't really want to get into that. But he just doesn't understand what these movies are, and he misunderstands that completely. And I feel like that's why kind of like these reviews are a little cringy and not really good criticisms of the Sam Raimi Spider-Mans, because he's not really getting into what these movies are. He's getting into his very skewed experience of it, and I don't really honestly find that entirely very insightful, much like how I feel about him in general anyway. Alright, so sorry. Let's get into questions. Oh man, Saber, that's a good question. Saber Sparks asks, Jim, question. You get $1 million, but you have to collab with the Nostalgia Critic on a video each week for a year. Oh my god, with him in charge, and he stays at your house in a bunk bed with you? Why does it have to be that part too? That's weird. I don't like that part. Well, $1 million is worth it. Sure. I guess I'll do that. Yeah, do I get top bunk? I think I would want top bunk in that situation. I don't think my wife would be into this idea, though. Why would he want to collab with me? Would I have to be in the video? I guess I'd have to be in the video with him. Ugh. I feel like, though, I could do a better job than... What's that guy? The guy who reviews, like, bad movies or whatever. I feel like I could do better than him. I think he writes for him. I feel like I could do better than that. Because there were times like, I feel like someone could be like, no, don't do that, Doug, do this. But if I had to be there with him, part of me died with that question. Saber, why did you do that to me? No, I don't know. I probably would have to do it, and I'd feel really bad. I would say I would do it. I would do all that, but I have to react to not liking him the entire time. I would be like, what? I don't know. And I would insist we review his own movies, and he gets to hear what I think about them. I would also say he has to be on the Pizza Party podcast, and Linkara has to too. If it's $1 million, I'm throwing out the negotiations. I want Linkara on the Pizza Party. Also Doug Walker. And Doug Walker would have to Pizza Party with me at least 4 times that year. I think that's... Did someone write Doug Walker as a class traitor? God, I want that shirt. Anyway, thank you for that, Saber. That is now my current nightmare, because I would definitely do that. I'm depressed. Alright.